of the thesis, because I keep telling you, you have to use your results to answer your thesis questions in the discussion. Obviously, that means you have to take every thesis question and answer it in the discussion. So that is already kind of a natural substructure. Use them. And if you don't have research questions, which is often the case in experimental thesis, you might have a hypothesis in there. In that case, you usually structure it according to your key findings. You measured something, and the 2, 3, 4 key findings, those will be your substructure. Talk about the first one, then the second one, then the third one. But you need some kind of substructure, otherwise the discussion is not going to be readable or writable at that. So in a little more detail, and I don't understand why these dots always look different. I changed them 3 times already, I think. Anyway, opening, we said that already. Restate your aim with your research questions and or your hypothesis, and shortly give your major findings. Then we have the body, that's point 2. It includes the interpretation of the findings. What do they mean? How they fit into the context of the literature. And also 2 more points. The consequences, what do they mean for the population as a whole? This would contain the recommendations you can make and the limitations of the study. When you say, how reliable are my results, essentially? Those 2 points should also be addressed. They would be in the major part. And then, of course, in the end, we still have the conclusions. So now we'll just run through these individual subsets, and I'll tell you what I think you should write in each case. So the opening, beginning, that's comparatively simple, comparatively short, because actually, really, in the first, you should again say what you wanted to do in your review or in your research. If it's a review, just summarize the goal. If it's experimental research or a study, you also summarize the goal, what was the aim of your research, and you also very shortly say what you did to achieve this goal. The main method, like you did a genetic analysis of, yes, very, very general. You don't do that in a review, because in a review the main method is always the same. It's a literature search, and it's detailed, the materials and methods. So you can, if it's a meta-analysis, you can go into a little more detail, but usually that's more important on the experimental side. And then next paragraph, really just 1 paragraph, short. Major findings. And there should be at least 1 major finding for each research question. If you don't have that, there's something wrong somewhere. Same here, major findings, not based on the questions, but in relation to your hypothesis, usually, if you don't have questions. Sometimes you do. That varies a little bit. So that's actually pretty straightforward. Why did I want to do it? What did I find? Most important. Some things to consider and keep in mind. When you summarize your study aim, actually look back up to the front of your thesis. You have your study aim in there. You usually don't copy things word for word, but essentially it's there. If you write it new, be short but precise, not vague. And here, make certain it matches what you said at the beginning. You'd be surprised how often I see it, that these things do not exactly match. And then, of course, you have a problem, because if the discussion is supposed to answer your initial questions, but isn't addressing the same initial questions anymore, you see what I'm getting at? Not good. Then, summarizing major findings. Now you have everything in the results. Here you say it very shortly, really just the key issues. And one thing to remember, no new or additional results. Everything you summarize here has to be in the results part. Obviously, you should have at least 1 key finding per research question. Sometimes it's even more because the questions are complex, but at least 1 should be there. Otherwise, the research question was obviously not addressed in the results. And then one thing to remember for the style of writing, you usually don't simply repeat the results. You have to make it very short, and you should not use the numbers here, but instead describe it in words, as opposed to the results, where it's usually exactly the other way around. Here you just say, method 1 had a much higher success rate than method 2. The details about how high this was, those are in your results. So now here you can just give the general summarized finding. That's the part about the opening. Second part, interpretation of my findings. And here you really have to address each research question or each key relevant finding. Usually review and study are again comparatively similar. Answer your questions. And here, what do they mean? Do they support your hypothesis or not? Your key findings. You can. That is the for a study, the key issue of the discussion. There you discuss whether your initial hypothesis, whether it can be refuted or whether it is supported. That's the conclusion you ought to arrive at the end. Then, of course, context, literature context goes for both of them. What did others find? What are the opinions of others? And explain, especially if you find differences. What might be the reason for those differences? Think about it. Might be the study design, anything else, any point you can make. If you cannot find a reason, that's also something to state. What do findings mean? Again, some points to consider. You see, it's not as structured as some as for the results, because you can say some things first and others second, so it's a bit vague, but best I could do. I've told you this, the best way to structure this part is by research questions or key findings. So you have blocks that deal with individual issues. You have to address each question you had at the beginning. You also have to address each result section. If you have a big result section that does not make any appearance in your discussion, then obviously you did not need this section to answer your question, so why is it there? So there always has to, these things always have to be connected to each other. So you also have to address all of your results. Important point for experimental thesis, you also have to do it if they're not statistically significant. You should at least mention them, address them, not just ignore them somewhere in there. What you do first, you state the answer to your question, using the relevant results, cite the work of others. That's already talked about that. These are some other things to consider. Do you see any patterns in your results? Do you see anything? Is anything interesting in them that they tell you? Talk about this here. Any relationships? Is it possible to develop a theory? Well, it's very high end, but well. Consider conflicting explanations of your results. Again, that's more for experimental work. There's usually not just one explanation possible. Sometimes it's two or more. Take them all into consideration. Is anything unexpected? Discuss that too. The literature context, that's usually the second part. Like I said, limit your new data severely. You can cite it to compare to your findings. If that data shouldn't appear in the discussion, in the results part, but limit that. When you compare, focus. Do not compare everything, but focus on that part that is really relevant for the question you are asking. Also consider the results of previous research. Can they help you interpret your own findings? Can they help you figure out how your results can answer the question, or what important things you might have to consider? If you find contradictions, others don't agree with you, measured something different or concluded something different, address this. That's a point of a good discussion, to also take opinions which may not completely agree with you. into consideration. You have to be as objective as possible, because at this point you think you are right, but you do not absolutely know it. But you want to try to convince the reader that he or she agrees with you. But just ignoring contradictory opinions, not the way to do this. That's if you are talking about multiple studies from others, try to give those a sequence too. Most important to least important, past to present, anything, so it doesn't appear mixed. Now, some specifics for the experimental study. As I said before, the discussion is mainly about this. You want to know, do I reject the null hypothesis or the alternative hypothesis? Theoretically, your data should tell you this. But usually you base this decision on the results of your statistical evaluation. Now, anybody who's ever done any statistical evaluation knows that does not always work out the way you want it to work out. Because sometimes you do not have a statistical significance. You have differences you can see in your graph. They're called trends usually, but it's not statistically significant. Now, what do? Reject or not to reject or not to reject? In that case, you have to discuss this in a lot more detail. You have your opinion based on the data, and give that opinion, try to argue your opinion. It can end with basically saying that like the trends appear to indicate that should be validated with further studies with a larger sample number or something like that. Come to a conclusion.